Hi, this is going to be a video tutorial on how I would go about thinking about what I'm drawing in a way that is going to allow me to scale it up or scale it down, to resize it bigger, smaller, and still try to keep most things in proportion. So I'm going to approach it in a similar way that I've started the other ones that we've been drawing, just sort of the same dimensions, sort of going across like this, and that's all great. But a lot of times you'll be trying to figure out how to both resize something as well as keep it in proportion. But I'm going to start the same with I'm making this mark at the top. I'm making a little mark at the furthest right, a mark at the lowest or bottom point, and a mark on the left side. And then I am going to create my bounding box. So I think I've been talking about it. Try to kind of sketching these crosshairs first. Makes it a little easier to not have to worry about if I can do this straight line all the way perfect to that. If I can just eyeball it. And it's that one. It's down here. So all I'm doing now is creating the bounding box, or the notional space. I will sketch that in lightly and loosely. Clean things up a bit with my handy dandy kneaded eraser. And then for this bounding box, I want to understand the proportions, or the ratio. Those are, I know, big can be kind of scary words, of the width to the height. I want to compare the distance of the width with the distance of the height. And that's going to be true for anything I'm drawing. I'm going to want to understand how those compare to each other. And what I like to do, as I tell my students, is instead of worrying about scary words like proportion and comparative measuring, all I think of is squares. And I have videos on sort of how I think of squares, but to do a relatively accurate square relatively quickly is something we can do and check pretty easy. So I'm going to use my pencil to check the distance from the tip to my thumb of the width. And then I'm going to take that distance and transfer it to the height. Because as we know, a square is a rectangle where all the sides are equal distance. So I think that's quite fine, especially for demonstration purposes. But so that's where the mark for my first square would be, of how many squares I could fit into this bounding box. That's all I'm thinking of. I'm not thinking about the wine bottle. I'm thinking about the bounding box right now. Trying to look past the detail of, this is part of this is really just an exercise in what you can focus on and what you can not focus on, which is tricky sometimes, because everybody everything in the drawing is saying, pay attention to me. Me. No, me. So, that was fun. So that was the first square. And as you may see from my previous use of this one, I have a mark for the second square, which is right about there. And then the third square, the next square, I can fit another one in here, so there's 1 and 2. It's going to be about there. And we'll take one last measurement this time, and to get, there's still more square. There's going to be, so 1, 2, 3, and the fourth square would be up there. So obviously the bounding box is not quite as big as 4 squares. So I want to figure out just how many squares this bounding box is. So I basically take all the whole squares I've done, and sometimes it can help to really kind of just sketch this square in, because they can be tricky to eyeball. I'm going to change that. They are tricky to... So it's good to just sort of keep getting familiar with sketching squares and sort of getting that proportions of things in your brain good and solid in your brain. This line I want to scooch over just a touch. Maybe even that one too. I think technically I'm not supposed to resize my rectangle after I've measured and done squares. So, but we're all staying friendly and light and sketchy, so everything's fine. So now I have this kind of remainder left over for the fourth square. So I want to figure out how big is this compared to this full square. And I'm just going to do a little bit of quick, no nonsense, not scary at all, division of what that fourth square would be. I'm going to break it up into basically half. Hopefully you can sort of see that it's about 3/4 of a square, but I'm going to try to, what I would do to try to be, pretty accurate with that, is thinking about this square, and if it was half of the square would be there at this halfway point. 3/4 of a square would be there. If it was just 1/4 of a final square, it would be there. So that's the idea for that. So I have 3 3/4 squares. And this really is, it's really sort of the same thing you'll be doing when you sort of learn sighting and how to look at draw things and understand proportions out in the real world. But like I say, this has helped me just sort of understand and get it down, and especially how to do the next step, which is to figure out how to transfer a rectangle of this proportion to wherever I'm drawing. So drawing 3 3/4 squares is something I could do this big. you get the idea, hopefully. That was a leaning cake. Or this big. Or this big. It's but obviously I'm being quick and messy with these squares, but I could check them, and I will be checking them pretty quickly. But the point is that as long as I can just sort of think of 3 3/4 squares, I can. That's not so scary. So I can figure out basically where I want to draw it, and if I'm drawing on a small piece of paper, I can cope with that, and if I'm drawing on a giant piece of paper, I can deal with that. If I want to draw it really big on a really big piece of paper, I can do that. If I want to draw it tiny on a big... So anyways, hopefully that makes sense. You can size it up and size it down and test it pretty quickly. I am going to first just kind of use my fingers to kind of think of what would 3 3/4, how would that fit in here? In sort of a decent size, but not too big. 1, 2, 3, 4. I'm going to try to make it a little bit smaller. Maybe something like this, just to really get across the point of scaling. I'm just kind of remembering that height in my brain. And I'm going to just loosely sketch in some squares. These are really not going to be accurate, I know, but I'm just going to try to get a sense of how big this wine bottle is going to be on this particular piece of paper. So let's say that's fine. Okay, that's fine. Now let's get a little bit accurate about this rectangle that I'm going to resize. Yes. So I will sketch some long sides here, as well as here. And then I will start thinking about making accurate squares. I am going to clean up that edge, because I do want to, I like starting out all sketchy with wide lines that give me a lot of option and where to go, where to refine. But it can be tricky if you're measuring off something that's really ambiguous and really vague. So I try to make it a little less vague as I keep going. So let's see. I transfer the width information to the vertical side. First square would really be about there. And what I'm going to do now is what, hopefully if you're getting comfortable with this, you'll realize you can do from the start. And that is just making the mark and not worrying about completing sketching in the square per se. So a great example of how off I was and just sort of my initial thought. So practice squares, not necessarily a simple thing. And check them. I thought you seemed a little dull. So let's see. So 1, 2, 3, and then this seems like it's a little bit. A little bit off still. So if 4 was there, I see what I did. If 4 was kind of there, then 3.5 would be about there. And 3 3/4 would be about there. I'm just breaking this last box up into quarters. So there is 3/4 of the square, which is represents this final portion up here. So there's 4 square. It's taking me back to elementary school. But that was a different configuration, as I recall. Either way. Practice squares and getting good at sort of imagining also what the diagonal. The diagonal is always going to be should be a perfect 45 degrees, but once again, that's getting into math and numbers, and it can be a good way to double check, because I feel like this one is a little bit loose, a little bit off. So spend some time making sure that indeed your rectangle is 3.5 squares. But to move on, I'm sorry, not 3.5, 3 3/4. So then I'm going to come back over here and I'm going to start thinking about the bigger shapes of. This is similar to anything we've been drawing, when we've been drawing it just in this straight across 1-to-1 dimension sort of thing. But I'm going to think about breaking up the thing that I'm drawing into large simplified shapes. Still going to think of this bottom body of the wine bottle as a rectangle first. And depending on which video you've seen, I've been sort of shifting around on how I think of how much I'm simplifying it, but I'm pretty sure what I've decided is just to think of this as a tall tapered trapezoid. And I also realize now that I haven't done what I tell everybody to make sure not to forget, and that is to sketch in the all-important center axis. And in hindsight, I would have already done that. I seem to say that a lot about the center axis. I probably should have drawn in the. It's good to watch these videos. It helps me learn too. Next time, draw in the center axis first. You dork. Okay, that was a little mean-spirited. But anyways, there's my center axis. And back to this tall tapered trapezoid. And then this final rectangle is how I'm going to break this up. Oop. You stay there. So then I have these simple shapes that are much easier to resize and scale up and down and determine if they're symmetrical and placed accurately and if they're the right proportion in my new drawing over here. So I have my squares, I have the places where I'm breaking things up into big shapes, my initial first big shapes. The tall trapezoid went to there, where the sleeve goes. There's another square there. Sometimes, it can be handy to do a little notating over here so you can make sure you're remembering which of these indicator lines is the square and which is a significant point, and sometimes I have halfway, and anyways, you can come up with a little system to make it not too scary. Oops. But I think I got lost there. Then that shape, the top, there's the fourth square. I did get confused there. Either way, I'm going to now transfer this over here. So, center axis. So there is a rectangle that's about 3 3/4 squares in its tall configuration format. Let's see, I want to think about this big shapes that I did. So if this is the second square, then this rectangle shape is going to be below that second square. And I could estimate sort of where it falls within this square and get that fairly accurate fairly quickly by once again breaking this up into quarters. I'm not sure how exact that is, but I could test that pretty quickly. So it's just about at the 3/4 mark, a little bit higher maybe. So let's see if that seems to be making sense. Yeah, good enough for now. So there's my first rectangle. And then I have my tall tapering trapezoid. And the height of that one goes up to a little bit above the third box. So I'm going to say that it's going to go to about there. And then the final rectangle is going to go up to about there. But how can I sort of figure out the width? Same kind of idea. I'm going to think about how this width, which is the top of my trapezoid, how that relates to the top edge here. And it's pretty close to just it's a little bit wider. The neck tapers ever so slightly, but I'm just sketching this in. So I'm going to think of how the width would fall onto here, onto my drawing. And like I think you've probably seen me say before, usually it's pretty much close to 1/3 of the overall width. So that's not perfect exact, but that's okay for just my block in here. So I know that the top of the trapezoid is going to be about there, the width. So this was where my first rectangle was. Here's my trapezoid. I'm employing my three-step technique for straight lines. Maybe it qualifies as 4 because there's that 4. I'm going to check with the drawing judges. I'll get back to you on that later. And then that's going to be about my final upper rectangle. So what I like about this approach, both being able to scale things up and down relatively quickly and relatively accurately, I'll grant you it's going to be trickier when you're looking at when you don't have a printout of something. But what I want to really kind of hone in and refine is my drawing at this stage, and not way down the line when after I've shaded things in some. And like a lot of artists, and maybe you too, I keep learning this over and over the hard way. As you improve, you'll get better at skipping steps, or just being able to intuit the steps, and they'll sort of your brain will figure them out automatically in the background, so you don't have to be thinking so hard. But like I was saying, I want to make sure that things seem pretty good at this stage right here, where I have this center axis. I have the width of my bounding box. Those are somewhat accurate. I have the size of my different shapes, the sizes of my different simplified shapes. And I'm also checking to make sure that those simplified shapes seem like they are all equidistant and in balance around the center axis. So if my rectangle is not lining up with this center axis, I want to know that now and not way later when I'm trying to figure out really involved details and get stuck and can't figure out just why it's off and get really frustrated. That's for my niece Michelle. So I'm sort of adjusting things here to try to make sure that they are mirror images of each other. I'm checking my other thing I want to do is check this negative shape. That seems like it's pretty good. And then from there I would go about continuing to just refine the drawing and adjust things, start adding more detail I'll do a separate video on and sort of breaking down this curve and how to try to think of that as well. But that's the basic idea of drawing something in a sized up, or this, in this particular case, sized down version. And for me, it really helps to break things down into how many, and first into a bounding box, and then figure out how many squares I could fit into that bounding box. And then what that really represents is the proportion of this particular rectangle. I like to say 3 3/4 squares. Technically, it would be, you would say the proportions are 1 to 3 3/4. So hopefully that helps. Try it on this and try it on any other objects and have fun.